Я очень рад представить следующего докладчика с очень интригующим названием доклада. Я надеюсь, что перевод работает. И мы давно звали Питера в Москву и рады, что он присоединился к нашей конференции. Питер Maassen здесь представляет факультет образования университета Осло, где, собственно, благодаря ему сейчас очень активно эта проблематика расцвела. Питер также руководил одним из ведущих в свое время в Европе центром исследований в области высшего образования в городе Твенте в Голландии. И он занимается активно проблемами оценки качества высшего образования, продуктивности сотрудников и так далее. О месте нашего сегодняшнего докладчика в образовательных исследованиях свидетельствует вот такая книжка, которая у меня есть, которая выпущена в честь его дня рождения коллегами из самых разных стран, специально посвященная исследованиям высшего образования. Как и другие пленарные доклады, у нас час на доклад, включая дискуссию, поэтому я больше не буду тратить время на представление. Прошу Питера начать.
Let me see. Thank you very much, Isaac. I want to thank the organizers and the Higher School of Economics for inviting me and giving this opportunity to share some of my research with you. It's a great honor and a pleasure for me. And it's also a pleasure because it gave me the opportunity to come back to Moscow. In the mid-1990s, there was a very intense relationship between the Netherlands and Russia in developing the educational systems. There was an intense collaboration, and the center that Isaac was referring to, CHAPS, was part of it, and I spent lots of times in Moscow around that time, but I haven't been back, so it's fantastic to be back in Moscow and see how much the city has changed and has remained the same. I will discuss the governance paradox, as I called it, with you, and that has to do with the title of the conference, Global Challenges, Local Commitments, which is pushing universities to some kind of competitive state. Universities are expected to be in various competitions. The national competition, national economies want to be globally competitive, and universities are supposed to play an important role. The competitions universities themselves are involved in, but who is supposed to be responsible for the competitive behavior of universities? More and more there's a focus on the institutional governance, however defined the actors, individual and collective, within the institution responsible for deciding on where the institution is going. And in the way that governance dimension and practice in universities has been developed, a paradox has come up that I want to refer to in my presentation. First, I want to start with briefly introducing to some of the research that we're doing in Oslo to give you an idea of where the empirical data come from on which this presentation is based, after which I will discuss this paradox from three perspectives: an historical one, an institutional theory one, and a prestige economy one, and end up with some conclusions. I'm chairing a research group at the University of Oslo called EXIT, but spelled this way: Expert Cultures, Institutional Dynamics. It's studies of higher education and work. And we focus on the one hand, issues of governance, on the other hand, teaching and learning and science within institutions, and we focus on getting a better understanding on how these two are related: national science structures, policies, and the intra-institutional behavior. And the focus, at least on my contribution to this work, is in Northwestern Europe and in Africa, where I'm involved since '94 in a large project on the development of research universities in Africa. Main institutional perspectives: institutional theory, epistemic cultures, and two of our projects that I will refer to here are one called European Flagship Project, also our esteemed colleague Marek Kwiek from Poland, who presented this morning, is involved in it with the University of Warsaw as a case. And we're interested in how universities that might be referred to as flagships interpret and use institutional autonomy internally. And a flagship in our project is a large comprehensive institution, not a specialized one, and it's in a large urban area. It's among the oldest of the country. And our research questions were, I formulated here. I won't read them to you. I'm sure the PowerPoints will be made available. But in essence, as said, we're interested in what's going on inside the universities. How have changes which are, amongst other things, aimed at making universities more competitive, how have they affected the internal life? And we focus on universities in 8 countries in northwestern Europe, a kind of horseshoe around Germany, assuming that Germany is coming 20 years behind, so they will pick up when these countries have moved on. We also looked at Australia and, as said, Poland with the cases that Marek Kwiek is doing. In this, we had an especial interest in the departmental level and a lot of research on higher education, which focuses on governance, studies the relationship, the formal relationship between state authorities and higher education institutions. There's relatively little empirical data available on the change dynamics at the departmental level. And here are the 4 areas: chemistry, psychology, public health, and teacher education that we focused on. And in this, we had a special interest in personnel policies and in research management. And here are some of the arguments why the departments are important. It goes back to the work of Burton Clark and Beecher and Troller. Also in US literature, there's a lot of emphasis on the changes around the department. If you look at the last quote here, in recent decades, dramatic environmental changes have shifted the conditions of academic staff members' work and challenged this model of professionalism, the traditional model in which the department was the core university building block. The selected institutions, here are some data. The rankings have been mentioned a lot today. I won't go into the pros and cons of rankings, but all the institutions that are selected in the 8 countries, the small countries around Germany, are research-intensive universities from Copenhagen to the University of Bergen. And just one simple indicator, we got lots of data on their research activities, output, funding, organization, management. I won't show all of that to you, but just as an indicator, we have the European Research Council functioning since 2007. It has been referred to as the European Champions League in research. It is creating a lot of management interest and action within universities, and you can see here that the universities part of our project have been quite competitive and successfully applied for ERC grants. There are about 100 universities in Europe which have about half of all the grants, and these universities have in total about 7.5% of all these grants. And the ERC projects are a very interesting component in the way in which these universities at the departmental level develop and adapt their research management. National reforms form a kind of framework. We are, as said, interested in studying how national reforms relate to institutional change. I won't go into the detail of all these reforms, but the Netherlands first and Finland last have gone through one or more reforms that were aimed at strengthening institutional autonomy, and there were a lot of assumptions underlying here that I will discuss in a minute. Another project, briefly, looks at horizontalization processes. Traditionally, governance, at least in Northwestern Europe, of higher education was very vertical. There are representatives from the university, also student unions, with the representatives from the Ministry of Education and possibly other national agencies in a vertical pillar were developing the higher education policies. And there's a horizontal dimension coming in there as a consequence of what has been mentioned a couple of times, the knowledge economy focus, which makes higher education a sector that is of much more interest to national knowledge policies, technology policies, innovation strategies, etc., than it used to be. And here we focus on two knowledge pillars. The policy pillar, which generally is top-down. In this project Horizon, we look more at education compared to the flagship project where we looked at research. Here, there's the assumption that the national public management system produces the framework conditions under which higher education institutions and within them faculties, departments and study programs adapt to the needs in society. And then you have the academic development, which is more bottom-up, where other actors play a role, and we were interested in how are these two related. And as those of you who know the academic literature are aware of, there's very, very little empirical studies that have analyzed and studied this relationship. Good. I will start with a historical perspective because it's important to go back not all the way to the Middle Ages, but at least to the emergence of the German research university, because it's such a dominant template also in our days for the way we interpret the university in its national context and the way it should contribute to socioeconomic needs. And the origin of this new university, and it's really a different university, the one that emerged in the 19th century than the one before. The origins of this university are of importance for understanding this governance paradox. A core period here was this period between 1815 and roughly 1850, the German Vormärz era, where the research orientation of the universities in Germany was strengthened. And as we all know, before that period, universities all over the world, with a dominance in Europe, were teaching-oriented. Research was not an activity that took place within universities. And still, within a relatively short time, the German university became very research-oriented. How did that happen? And how did that affect the professorship? And what is also of interest is what are the disciplinary developments that are a result of this emergence of the modern research university. A very interesting researcher studying the professorial research orientation, and again, until the early 19th century, the professorial orientation in universities anywhere in the world was teaching-oriented. It was not in any way whatever research-oriented, but it changed rapidly in the German context. And here are some quotes from Turner that give an indication of the way in which the universities changed from the science orientation of humanists and philosophers that had an impact also on science. And there was a very strong condemnation of what was called Broodstudium, so bread studies, which was doing research that was of relevance to society. So there was a very strong rejection of any kind of contract research or research directly related to the needs of society on the basis of the assumption that only pure science could produce knowledge that in the end would be relevant for socioeconomic and political continuation and progress. And in this period, the traditional loyalty of the institution, of the professorship to the institution changed into this dual loyalty to institution and discipline. And a long quote from Turner represents and describes what that meant. It meant that in the loyalty to the institution, the professor is a colleague with a focus on teaching and being a stimulated teacher. But the second loyalty looks at profession and at the discipline as a whole. And the consequence of the changes at that time, again, it's important for understanding where we are now in our attempts to modernize university governance. The consequence were that a large part of the responsibility within the university for managing, for governing the activities of the professors moved out of the institution. The radical transformation, the literature here is in general in agreement. Three main courses. One was Humboldtian ideology, focusing on Wissenschaft, creativity. Creation of new knowledge would be the driver for the development of a new society and a new citizen. The second was competition in the German university system. Competition and decentralization, focusing very strongly on the productivity and the status of the professors. And the third force, which is of great importance, is the role of the state that took over from the institutions the main power in appointing professors, and that emphasized the research output of professors. There are lots of cases that Turner and others are reporting about where universities were protesting against the appointment of a new professor because the professor didn't have any teaching experience. In some cases, the professor didn't even speak German and couldn't teach in German. But all these protests were rejected by the ministry, who in a relatively short time managed to radically change the profile of the German professoriate. And the governance issue that came out of it is that the university had a contract with the professor and is paying for the teaching and other university center functions of the professor, but the recruitment of professors, and professor here in a broad sense, including all tenured academic staff members, as well as the advancement of professors in the academic world, the institutional values, the criteria that the professors are using to determining what is good and what is not good, also in their teaching activities, came from the discipline. So the disciplinary values and criteria were more important than the institutional one. And it was the first time in the history of the university, and it has continued because of the dominance and the spread around the world of this German university template. If we then go to the 1980s and the period since, and the governmental reform agendas that tried to change the university into a more competitive organization, a more integrated strategic actor, here we see some of the ideological perspectives underlying these reforms. They're very, very strongly expressed. I remember from my time in the Netherlands that we had lots of meetings at the ministry where the staff from the ministry, using references to Stafford Beer, to Habermas, to other scholars, were really promoting a specific view on how the formal relationship between university and state authority should be changed. And it included these three elements. You need one element of government control. Universities can never be fully autonomous. You also need to emphasize network configurations where other actors come in, and you need to bring in an element of market. And that last element has kind of replaced the other components, the cybernetic system approach, the Habermasian approach of exchange of information, etc. So there's a strong focus on this third ideology, competitive governance. And that's what we've seen more and more dominating national reform agendas. And the basic assumption here are autonomous universities will more effectively accommodate the needs of various stakeholders in the knowledge marketplace. Strategic actorhood of more autonomous universities leads to a more healthy system integration and diversity. And the elements are that, the assumption are that a professional university leadership management will strategically identify a fitting niche for the university. And they will use this institutional autonomy to strengthen the integration of the university. In other words, the university will be able to move from being a loosely coupled organizational system, that the way in which it was interpreted 60s, 70s, into a more tightly coupled strategic organization. And the global reform script expressed it like this: we need structural reform, focus on formal university autonomy, professional management. There are other elements in it. The autonomous universities will be able to become more responsive with a strong leadership and more strategic, and they will, as a consequence, engage more directly with society's needs, and the university contribution to society's needs will improve. You can find lots of quotes nationally as well as Supranationally, the European Union, the European Commission has various examples in which the underlying distrust in the university is expressed in the sense that the university, as it operated in essence since the 19th century, doesn't contribute enough to society's needs, and therefore these structural reforms are more than necessary. But, and anyone who has studied university policy, and I've done that since the 1980s, will sooner or later raise this question: why are the outcomes of university reforms in general not in line with the reform intentions? A neglected perspective here is that most governments do not take into account that here we have an institution which has been operating since the Middle Ages, and in some respects before, and it's become the dominant institutional form for handling knowledge in societies. The history is very important. These two loyalties and the way they affect the behavior, the preferred behavior within and attitudes of staff within the institutions. Also, the fact that universities cannot be changed overnight. They operate on stable principles. The fact that we, as academic staff of universities, are, for example, aimed at producing academic publications, articles, book chapters, patents, etc. There's no law saying it. It's part of our understanding of our own role and our interpretation of our institution. Also, you can look at legal frameworks and contracts, performance contracts, the outcome of negotiation, but they don't tell you the whole story about what a university actually is. You also have to look at the role that the university has developed throughout the century for itself, and how it has responded to changes in society and contributed to it. And also, impacts of reforms depend on how they match with and are absorbed by existing cultures, practices, institutional, disciplinary identities. We have many examples of quite radical reforms where we've seen as an outcome that the university is not adapting to the reform, but the reform is adapted to the university in practice. So this kind of understanding of the university from an institutional perspective is also of importance for understanding its robustness, and the fact that even though the end of the university has been announced now for at least 200 years, I don't think it has come any closer. What's the governance issue coming out of it? These reform ideologies assume that universities can become more tightly coupled. And they can have leadership that's in control of the primary production processes. But the university leadership has only very limited control over their primary processes, at least within the institutional context. So a possible consequence is that the more tightly coupled the university is, the more the leadership manages to control the primary processes, the greater the chance that the university loses prestige and its attractiveness for top academics and highly talented students. A third perspective, prestige economy, that relates to the work of many colleagues, amongst others Sheila Slaughter, and in the US, Simon Marginson's work. There is obviously a relationship between competitive funding and the way in which funding regimes of universities change and university governance. Now, prestige economy as a term, and you can look at it also more broader from a political economic perspective, but in this specific focus that I present here, it represents the argument that some external resources are preferred over others. Not all external resources are equally attractive. And those that are most attractive are the resources that are derived from research. And they are preferred to resources that are derived from instruction. And this is especially true for, of course, for research universities, but more and more also universities and polytechnics that aspire to become research universities follow this logic. So this prestige economy that is created increases a kind of segmentation within institutions in which state is given to some revenues at the expense of others, consultancy, tuition fees, etc., leads to a higher status within institution for some departments, some units, some academics over others. And you see also the consequences of that in the internal governance reality within the institution. So in the US, what you see, according to the work of Slaughter and others, is a segmentation among units, whereby high prestige units, units that are very successful in the external competition for research funding, are affected by competitive logic. As long as they're successful, they can profit from their success. And low prestige units that are not successful in the external competition for funding are affected by an administrative logic. The competitive logic means that the department will get a reduction in educational tasks and activities, especially at the undergraduate level, more internal resources usually coming from tuition fee earned by other departments, more tenured positions, and more control over resources. While low status means that the administration steers the education that the department is offering through the allocation of resources and academic position. So while the academics themselves are in control over the external research funding for which they have competed successfully, the academics who are more dependent on tuition fee are not in control of that income segment of the university. Prestige economy in the US. How about Europe? What we see here is that there is a converging trend in the competition for research. Here we see that also in European countries and in other parts of the world, there's a growing emphasis on distributing top research money, but also strategic research money through competition. A diverging trend is that in Europe, still a large part of the educational costs are funded by the government. So the tuition fee is a very small segment of the income of the institution. So basic grants are relatively stable and cover between 50 and 90% of the budgets of the institution. While in the US, they've dropped to in some states considerably below 15%, making many of the public universities, instead of state universities, state-funded universities, state-located universities. In universities in Europe, even though the basic grants are still stable, relatively spoken, external research funding also here reflects a high prestige and educational income, a low prestige. And again, that can be traced back, amongst other things, to these two loyalties and the importance they have played in the university template. So briefly, the European version of a prestige economy is that also in Europe more and more educational governance is affected by administration, by the administration of the institution with their logic, trying to standardize and in other ways impact the way in which the educational programs are offered. So the European reality does not allow the administration to control the income per se, but what it does is controlling education through procedures and regulations. So you see a growing density of regulations, administrative regulation with respect to educational practices in Europe. When it comes to the external funding of research, what we see is negotiation for more autonomy. We've seen in our flagship project that those researchers, and as Marek also has emphasized this morning, that are successful in competing for ERC face a very different reality within their institution than those who are not successful. An example, the University of Vienna, a university with almost 100,000 students, but only 240 professors or so. But every staff member who's successful in the competition for ERC, who does not have a professor position yet, will automatically be appointed to the professor level. And there are other consequences like that. So very high prestige linked to certain programs for funding research, which has an impact on the internal governance, educational obligations, etc. But there's no uniform trend in Europe. There are major differences between countries. So unlike the US, we don't see the segmentation between units. But if there's a segmentation, and at least in the flagship universities that we looked at, that we studied, there is a growing segmentation. It's not between units, but between individual academic staff members. So the governance issue coming out of it is that university management, prefers maximizing prestige and not maximizing income. Prestige is more important than income. As a result of the prestige economy, university leaders aim at combining greater control over education and low prestige research activities with less control over high prestige research activities. We've seen in all these universities that those who are successful in the competition for high prestige external funding manage to negotiate a very different administrative and management reality than those who are not successful. So what's the resulting paradox? I mentioned the word paradox. The starting point here is that current reform agendas want universities to become more responsive to society's needs, to the grand challenges that societies are facing. This implies creating this tighter coupling among institutional and disciplinary settings, the two settings where academic work takes place, and it should be realized by university leadership. In order to be able to realize this coupling, university leadership should become more professional. That is, it should become more hierarchical, more strategic, more executive, and supported by a professional administration that operates in a more standardized, specialized, formalized way. And any one of you who have studied the professionalization of university leadership, management, and administration will recognize these the standardization, specialization, formalization of administration, and the growing executive nature and hierarchical nature of university leadership. However, in practice, as indicated, university leaders have only limited control over the primary processes and the outcome of the primary process. You can measure the productivity of academics, but it's very difficult to control the academic activities in such a way that you, with 100% certainty, can predict the outcomes. There's no control from the institutional leadership directly over the disciplinary settings. For example, the criteria used by research councils to decide on which project proposals are eligible for funding and in the end will be selected for funding and which not. So the paradox is that the more the university leaders operate in line with reform agenda ideologies, the less effective they are in realizing the reform intentions. So what do we see in these flagship universities and in university practices, also in other parts of the world? There is a kind of starting point in the professionalization where bottom line management is emphasized. So one size fits all administration, every academic staff member has to be controlled, if I may use that word, managed is a more friendly word, in the same way. There are these kind of institutional production targets. An example from one of the universities that we are involved in, the board recently decided that by 2020 the volume of externally funded research has to be increased by 60%, and it goes in the same way for all faculties and departments. So there's also an attempt of tighter coupling of academic units, staff to institutional management and leadership. But the most productive professors and units are exempted there. They can negotiate, and they do negotiate, a looser coupling to institutional management. And what you see in those institutions that have moved beyond bottom line management is that institutional leadership at all levels is looking for more flexible, more horizontal, more academically anchored ways in making their managerial and leadership decisions. So instead of having these homogeneous production targets and ways in which staff's performance is assessed and evaluated, you see more and more move away from these management by objectives to a management by assessment and judgment, where we've seen various examples of, for example, at the faculty level, deans who within their faculty identify groups that, in the words of one of the deans, that are onto something. And we don't know what the outcome will be, but in the next 5 years, we will not ask them for any kind of publication. We will see in 5 years where they are, where they have reached, what they have achieved, and then we'll make a decision again how to manage them for the next 5 years, while in the same faculty, there are other groups that are much more tightly managed. So this kind of management by assessment and judgment is a practice that is not only emerged in universities, but we can also see it emerging slowly at the national level. And a very interesting example is the Netherlands. I don't know if you remember the student uprising in Amsterdam last year, where students occupied buildings and later also joined by staff, and a major criticism of students and staff was that the university leadership was too much focused on results, on outcome, on productivity. And the Dutch government, first and foremost the Dutch Minister of Education, agreed and has sent a proposal to Parliament to shift power within Dutch universities from the executive board and leadership to student and staff, and power in personnel policies, in budget decisions, etc. And the main argument is that the executive leadership of the university has pushed the university too much on the basis of economic criteria and has neglected academic development. And the assumption is that if you move part of the power back to academic staff and students, the academic development will become more central again. This doesn't mean that the reforms of the 2000s are now pushed aside, but in my view, this is a very interesting example in this part of the world of a learning approach that both at the national and institutional level has emerged, where at least some of the governments and some of the institutional populations are taking an interest in what works and what doesn't work, and how can we learn from what doesn't work to improve our governance and the way in which we handle the various tasks and functions that we have. So conclusions. Of course, the governance relationship, state, higher education, is dependent on a number of factors. It has been emphasized this morning. It's very important to take that into account. What's the legal status of the university? Not in all countries, universities have become independent legally of the state. There are still countries where universities are part of the state structure. Institutional traditions and cultures, the disciplinary fields that are represented in an institution, the culture, very important, the national context, the tradition, the success of the institution in the competition for external funding, nature of change in the institutional personnel policies. I haven't gone into that at all, but it's a very important area. The most important resource of the university is, of course, the human resource, and how does the university manage that, and the actor dimension. So we see variations between flagship universities, but also within institutions when it comes to these governance structures and practices, where even at the departmental level we see many different kinds of examples of how governance challenges are handled. And also what we see is that flexible governance approaches have emerged, where existing forms of loose coupling are continued. New practices are introduced where you find very different kinds of couplings within the institution between leadership and academia than, let's say, 20 years ago. Some forms more loose coupling, others more tight coupling, and also a better understanding of productivity and how productivity can be managed away from this one-size-fits-all approach, the bottom-line approach. So overall, leadership and professoriate are becoming more effectively coupled under new governance approaches. You see these kind of interactions that lead to a more flexible approach to management, to governance, but there's still a mismatch between flexible leadership, effective academia, and professional administration. And to end, one quote from an interview, the flagship project with one of the professors, a professor from a natural science discipline who was part of a large project in the institution in life sciences, working with colleagues from 3 other faculties. And I said, and in his view, university administration has become much more professional, but at the same time far less effective and supportive. I think that summarizes some of the struggles that universities are dealing with in this new competitive era, where the governance approaches that are promoted might not necessarily lead to the outcomes expected. Thank you very much for your attention. I have not been able to go into detail of into the empirical data that we have, but I'm more than willing to do it either in the discussion or later on in conversations during the break. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. You cannot imagine how relevant what you said for the Russian situation, because I cannot resist to make this comment, because just during last weeks, not even months, we discussed a number of questions of accelerated university development, the role of leadership, the push for the excellence. The very word push for the university sounds silly, but it's a reality. And frankly speaking, I understand why the government wants it. And you highlight that often these intentions, positive intentions by the government, we understand them, do not lead to the expected outcomes. And I think that's one of the discussions we are going to have further during this conference. Коллеги, пожалуйста, вопросы и комментарии, можно дискуссионные. Yes, please. Пожалуйста, по-русски или по-английски, все равно.
So, thank you very much. My name is Lucas Bischoff. I'm currently a visiting research fellow at the Higher School of Economics. I would be interested, firstly, what kind of evidence is there that, in fact, the new governance and management instruments have reduced the effectiveness of universities? And if I may, maybe just a second question. In the Dutch case, what is the rationale that giving more, or in which areas does the government decide to give more power back to staff and students, and what is the rationale that that will in fact improve quality?
Yes. First of all, the evidence comes from our data, where we see that universities that have introduced a bottom line approach, bottom line management approach, which means a standardization, routine kind of solutions to all kinds of different academic situations, both in teaching, education, and in research. That kind of standardized approach leads to a frustration as expressed by academics, and we've seen quite a number of cases where academics have moved away from the institution. There's also work by Don Heller in the US that has gone into exactly the same kind of tension between administration, leadership, and academics, and he formulated it this way: the closer the administration comes to the successful academic, the more that person is inclined to move to another institution. In essence, when you look at the Dutch case, it's a very interesting case, because the reforms in 1997 that introduced a new governance structure with executive boards, and all members of the executive board were appointed by the minister. They could be nominated by the institution, but appointed by the minister. These executive boards then also got the responsibility to appoint the rector. And the rector got the responsibility to appoint the deans and could also fire, and we've seen cases of that. Now, this board also included a number of people from industry, and in many cases, the economic agenda became more important than the academic one. So that's the argument the minister is using now also, and that is kind of the final drop that made the bucket flow over for the students, that the decision was made to sell a building in which the humanities faculty, part of the humanities faculty was housed, to make a profit out of that sale without involving the departments that were affected. That was kind of the example that has been used. There are more examples to say that this does not have a positive impact on the academic development of the institution. So the assumption now is that you have to find a balance. So not take away, of course, the positive experiences with a more executive and a more professional leadership, but try to combine certain responsibilities for an executive leadership with a more collegial model for handling academic affairs within the institution. That's the essence of the proposal that Parliament most likely will accept, because the majority parties have already indicated that they think positively about the proposal.
Thank you. Thank you. Пожалуйста, еще вопросы? Вижу. Вы хотели? Да, пожалуйста, пожалуйста. Гаги, пожалуйста.
Да, спасибо большое. У меня следующий вопрос. Вот как вы думаете, погоня за рейтингами и то, что сейчас университеты ищут свое место под солнцем и ближе вот к высоким этим местам, не заставляет их именно делать ставку на управленческую работу больше? Да? И как это может отразиться именно на той стороне, которую мы называем автономией университета или автономными ценностями или ценностями автономной идеологии? Спасибо.
University governance is an incredibly complex task and function. Here we have this old institution with lots of very stubborn and very smart academics that operate within the institution and in a disciplinary setting, and in general know better. And there you have your national and to some extent global context, which is expecting that the university in its internal governance becomes more interested and more directly coupled to the needs of society. So how do you combine these two? Now, it's a kind of a pendulum, of course, and there's not one ideal model in which to do that. But I would say, on the basis of the evidence from our research, that in a number of countries, the pendulum has pushed a bit too much to this executive model, where the expectation is that a professional leadership management, like in a business corporation, a modern business corporation, can to a large extent control the production processes. And that is an illusion. That doesn't mean that there's no need for a professional leadership management structure, because universities are, as said, highly complex organizations which have grown so dramatically that if you look at the university that was on top here of this list that I showed, Copenhagen, has a budget now of close to 2 billion euros. So it's an enormous institution, 2 billion euros. So you can't handle that on an amateur base. But how do you combine professional management leadership with effective administration, which is flexible and can adapt to the growing diversity in the academics environment? Because not all academics are successful in competing for external high status sources. So how can you combine that? And there I would say that universities that have moved very much to this control within their national setting, to this control orientation, are now moving back and trying to understand how can we combine this control need, where we have to get a better understanding not just of what works and what doesn't work, but also who functions and who doesn't function, but not on one agenda, but on different agendas. How can we combine that with a practice at the departmental level, where some academics will have freedom and others will have less freedom? And one of the biggest challenges that hasn't been mentioned this morning, but which I think is an incredibly important part of the university reality, how do you make sure that these two loyalties to teaching and research come in a better balance? We heard from one of the deans that we interviewed, any staff member with a tenured position in my faculty who's not successful in the external funding for research, either from the National Research Council or from the EU, will be punished. He or she will have to teach more. So in that sense, that imbalance is also something that has to be taken into account.
Да, пожалуйста. Да-да.
Actually, I wanted to discuss the contribution to society issue. The way how you frame it sounds really this knowledge in really knowledge economy paradigm. But when I start thinking about that from knowledge society paradigm, I really think that something like social awareness, socialization, and this stuff is somehow lost when we start thinking about this effective management and this triangle when there is state, market, and universities. How do you think these social issues and the role of university as a social actor can be placed there, and how it works in this probably dichotomy or just on this scale when the government has some pressure on universities and also universities has some opinions and try to perform as actors? How do you think this social role of universities can be put here? Thank you.
Спасибо.
Yes, the social role of universities was part of this student uprising and staff uprising in Amsterdam. It was a clear response to this, in the eyes of those involved, overemphasis on the knowledge economy, the economic agenda. So that's part of the debates also now in the Netherlands, the social dimension. How can you get it back in? So we've seen in a number of these universities various attempts to strengthen what you would refer to as social dimension. University of Amsterdam is a good example. It has a very popular, effective, and interesting Center for Multidisciplinary Studies, which has introduced new multidisciplinary master programs with titles like Social Needs of the Future and things like that. So there are various examples, and also in this case, universities are fascinating institutions because they are not these homogeneous gray blocks that follow one road. They follow various paths at the same time. So you will find in these universities various examples. One issue in all of this is what you also refer to. How does it relate to the national strategy and the national agenda for higher education? Because in many countries, understandably so, and Isaac was also referring to, governments have more eye for the economic agenda than for the social agenda. And the competitiveness of the national economy is, of course, a major concern for all governments. So therefore, in many national strategies, there's an emphasis on the economic agenda and the economic aims. But here, the universities themselves can play a role and are playing a role. And it also, again, should make us aware of the fact that universities are not blind followers. They are not acquiescent institutions in that sense, but they are, in many respects, doing justice to their long institutional history.
Да, пожалуйста. Там сзади нет, тогда, Гаги, к вам второй вопрос. Да.
Спасибо. Я думаю, что не злоупотребляю, но все-таки, когда мы говорим о социальных, так сказать, функциях университета, может быть, мы подчеркиваем вот это понятие общественного блага, то есть это public good, да, вот это понятие, которое, наверное, надо переинтерпретировать, потому что оно связано с академическими достижениями. А сейчас у нас достижения только в академических, так сказать, параметрах нельзя мерить. Может быть, это нуждается именно в этом изменении самого понятия как такового, потому что вот эта борьба двух идеологий, менеджериальной и академической, она достигла, по-моему, уже своего предела, да, и вот этот маятник неизвестно, куда будет качаться. Каково ваше отношение к нему? Спасибо.
I think you have a point there, but at the same time, in our societies, with the growing understanding of and focus on grand challenges, the grand challenges that are a reality for all of us, from the environment to energy, sustainable energy, to healthcare, education, etc. Now, it is understandable that governments, when looking for ways to handle these grand challenges, are looking at the university. The university has become the transversal problem solver. Whatever society's interpretations of its problems are, it's always looking at the university to find solutions. And in that sense, you're right that there is a link between national agendas for handling grand challenges and the role that universities are expected to play. But at the same time, as also our colleague from Italy this morning was emphasizing, as is clear, there is not a one-to-one relationship between investments in academic research or in teaching programs and societal outcomes. There's not a simple economic model that says if you invest €1 in research, in 10 years from now you get 10 euros in return. It's not as simple as that. So there is an element of risk in here. And my presentation tried to point to the fact that in trying to find a balance between these various functions of the university, we might have seen too much an emphasis on one specific element, and that is the link to the economy, and that the complexity of that relationship is often neglected in the way in which the reforms are implemented and interpreted.
У нас есть время для последнего вопроса, и я его задам. Павел, да, прошу прощения, потому что я увидел в зале своего хорошего товарища и бывшего заместителя министра образования России, который пытался решить следующую проблему. Хотелось бы услышать, что думает Питер по этому поводу, поскольку я для этого перейду на английский все-таки, чтобы точно сформулировать вопрос. You mentioned the autonomy of universities as an important resource for their positive role, for their energy, etc., etc. But interestingly, early post-Soviet times for the Russian universities were times of very high level of autonomy, extremely high. Some of universities were privatized by the professors, I would say, because professors selected rector who then followed, who had an agreement with them. We would call it disengagement pact. So universities got autonomy, and at the same time they became very passive. They tried to keep the status quo. And the last ministry, for example, in Russia, had to deal with that, had to push universities to change the status quo. So what if we have, I would say, sick universities, you know, okay, passive universities? What can be done besides to change the leadership and to give the leadership the role to push the faculty?
Yes, this is a very important issue and a very important question. First of all, university autonomy can never be an aim in itself. There is no argument, either ideological or scientific, that would allow you to say that maximum university autonomy leads to maximum results. Absolutely not. There is a tradition that goes back to the early universities to try to understand the university's embeddedness, if I may use that word, in the national public governance or public management system. So the university is part of public administration, and it's governed as part of public administration. And within that context, there is a continuous kind of pendulum movement between more autonomy and less autonomy. We've seen examples, Germany is a good example here, where in the last 10 years, autonomy of universities in certain certain states have been reduced. Amongst other things, and I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing, but it's a political reality. So given that universities are not independent institutions, that they use large amounts of public and private funding, that they have to operate within national and in some cases international legal and regulatory frameworks, there has to be an understanding within this public administration system who is responsible for what. What does seem to be a kind of a lesson from an analysis of university operation is that the combination of university responsibility for its part of its own operation has certain outcomes. So if you give the universities more autonomy in the area of personnel policies, human resources management, that will have certain outcomes. If you reduce the autonomy there, it will have certain outcomes. So it is, I think, important not to see autonomy as some kind of measurement where you can say, like the European University Association is trying to do. In Norway, the universities have autonomy level 79, and in Italy it's 74. That's not what you're referring to. But to try to find this balance between what should be the responsibility of the authorities and what should be the responsibility of the institution in this, and what kind of corrections are possible if this relationship is not effective. I think that's important.
Питер, большое спасибо. И думаю, что мы все можем поблагодарить нашего докладчика. Я хочу напомнить, что как раз дискуссия об измерениях вклада университетов в развитие общества в будущем у нас поставлена на завтра. Думаю, что это будет горячая дискуссия. Хорошего завершения первого дня конференции, коллеги.